Phantasy Star for the Master System was one of the best 8-bit RPGs I've had the pleasure of finishing, and when I found out that there were 3 other games in the series, I bought them with the assumption that it could only get better from there. The others were all for the Sega Genesis, so more sophisticated graphics and music were likely, and in an effort to play the games in order, I decided to tackle the sequel instead of shuttling directly to 4, the rumored glowing gem and the crown of the series. Well, let me tell you. Phantasy Star II paled in comparison in almost every way to the first game for a multitude of reasons, and I don't think I've felt this disappointed in a game in a long time. The closest comparison I can think of is Illusion of Gaia for the SNES, and I still think I liked that game better than this one. The story of Phantasy Star II picks up 1,000 years into the future after the first game's ending. Part of the Algo star system is now humming along under the control of Mother Brain, a giant computer that monitors and controls environmental conditions on the planets to make life better for the residents. The game opens with the news that something's wrong with a place called the Biosystems Lab, one of many places controlled by Mother Brain, so you and your companion Nay set out to discover what's caused this facility to start producing terrible monsters that are now roaming Moda's landscape and forcing the planet into a state of chaos. Without spoiling too much of the story, you and your party eventually end up on the run from the government that points the finger at you and your comrades for causing trouble with Mother Brain. The plot in Phantasy Star II is one of its strongest points when it's not being totally confusing, and in the beginning of the game, the directives that set the stage for the adventure are crystal clear, making it easy to explore Moda to keep things rolling. As the game pressed on though, this momentum slowed to a crawl, with the way forward involving thoroughly combing over every inch of the planet and its towns for clues. This isn't completely unexpected from games from this era, but the whole side plot that involves the piano teacher that you need to find to learn the music technique in order to play an evil piano deep within a dungeon as a means of opening a door was one of the most obtuse I've ever seen. Especially since the only time you hear about this piano teacher is in an offhand comment from one townsperson. The resolution to this whole barrier was walking beyond a town's border to find a new area. In other games, hiding things this way was usually reserved for extra treasures or bonus money as a reward for a good explorer, but stashing both a mandatory plot-driving person and an item like this was kinda scummy. The intricacies of Moda are nothing compared to what unfolds on Dezo. By the time you reach the second planet, the plot had dissolved down to practically nothing, leaving things very open-ended. I felt this approach was a bit lazy, and this part of the game was heavily padded with long, horrible dungeons to explore on a massive fetch quest. When the story did reappear briefly from time to time, it was actually really well done, and given the game's unique setting, it definitely stands out among other JRPGs of the time. If there had been some more story and some way to rein in so much of the aimless wandering in the back half of the game, I would have liked the whole experience a lot more. Did I mention that once you arrive on Dezo, that you're immediately thrown into a brand new dungeon just to get to the planet's surface? You go through 4 back-to-back dungeons before flying there, and instead of the game giving you some relief by letting you explore freely, your prize is getting launched into another one right away, making the main hub of a new planet a terrible maze that beat me down really hard every time I went in there, made me really start to loathe the game. And when you finally make your way out of there, but you haven't found the item that lets you translate the locals' gibberish so that you can actually save, it's back and you go until you die, or find the spaceport to get back to Moda. Why couldn't it have been like Phantasy Star I, where you just walk out of the spaceport and start exploring? This seemed like a pretty terrible decision, and I never returned to Moda afterwards because of just how inconvenient they made it to go back and forth. The dungeons that you spend hours and hours wandering around in are a far cry from the original Phantasy Star's first-person perspective fare. The ones in Phantasy Star II are presented in a top-down view, and I was actually enjoying them in the first stretch of the game. I was relieved at not having to worry about getting turned around or having to hand map multi-floor complexes square by square on grid paper, but that luster quickly faded as these sprawling buildings became more and more complicated. Phantasy Star II's dungeons were some of the most confusing I've ever had to wander through in an RPG. They have elevators or stairs that bring you between floors, but it's very easy to lose track of which floor you're even on. In bigger places, there are numerous paths to try that just simply dead end, resulting in a lot of trial and error as well as backtracking. One thing that the game did to throw a bone to the player was to provide a very extensive hint book with maps of these places included, and although it's helpful as an overview, it's severely lacking in detail. For example, the way some objects in the dungeons are drawn can make you think that you can go down a path when it's really blocked off. Or sometimes, when you have to fall down a pit in a very specific way to land on a ledge on a floor below, it's hard to know what to do since things don't line up quite right. For me, even with all the maps from this book right in front of me, I had a very hard time winding through these places and planning a way forward. You're so zoomed in and everything looks so similar that it's hard to get a feel for where you are, and they put graphics in the foreground to distort your surroundings even more. My copy of the game didn't come with the book, so I had to use a scan someone uploaded online, and even then, more often than not, I resorted to copies of the maps that people made with numbered stairwells and a clear description of where to go. For a kid with all the time in the world, this is a perfect game to get lost in, but there's no way I would have had the patience to figure all of this out without some kind of detailed visual. You know what could have made the endless dungeons more exciting? Some kind of boss fights. I get to the end of a huge place anticipating some kind of battle, and there would be absolutely nothing except me teleporting back out to the overworld and wondering if I'd missed something. This lack of closure after finishing a dungeon made the game feel extremely empty. Where's the excitement? Where's the tension? Wander through a terrible place, open up some chests with items that may or may not be important, rinse and repeat. This is Phantasy Star II. When there's a boss encounter waiting for you at the end of a long slog, at least you feel like you're working towards something and you have some mechanism to apply what you've learned while leveling up your skills along the way. It gives you something different to do other than auto-battling your way through what feels like the millionth encounter with these 5 bunnies. Phantasy Star II doesn't give you the privilege of testing yourself, and it was boring because of it. Likeable party members can make up for some of these shortcomings, but most of the characters in Phantasy Star II were not captivating in the slightest. The playable characters in the original Phantasy Star had just enough personality and connectedness to make them interesting. And more importantly, each had their own valiant reasons for joining Alice on the adventure. In Phantasy Star II, even the main character seems to lack any degree of personal conviction for the mission he's on, other than that he's an agent being sent out on an investigation. He and Nay are the only 2 characters that get a development arc in the game, but everyone else that joins does so in a way that feels completely disconnected from the plot. Most of them have their own selfish agenda rather than assembling to fight for the greater good, like Mr. I Like Robots or Ms. I Steal because it makes me feel something. I wish these characters and their ambitions were of some consequence and intertwined even a little bit with the story. Many of them seemed like they were added just to fill a space in the party rather than advancing any emotional depth or connection for the player. In the character roll call at the end of the game, I couldn't actually recognize some of their portraits. That's how little the game made me care for many of them. In addition to this, there were too many characters with overlapping skill sets to make newcomers feel valuable over ones that I had already been working with, so my roster was more or less decided within the first few hours of the game. It was also frustrating that new party members always came in at level 1. You would think an experienced hunter or a robot assassin would have some experience under their belt to show for their lives before they knocked on your door, but no. This made it really undesirable to want to substitute anyone new in. I could have easily doubled or tripled my playtime, leveling up everyone equally since grinding for experience takes a very long time. The best character by far was Nay. She was both versatile and strong, and probably had the most compelling backstory of any character in the game, even more so than the lead. Of course they killed her off permanently. They took away the one character that I was remotely invested in and left me with riffraff like Hugh and Kane that just became permanent fixtures in my house that probably ate all of my cereal while I was away. It was a real shame that there wasn't any development of relationships or camaraderie between the other characters, because to me, the group just felt like a bunch of people going through motions together with no real stance on the cause at the heart of the game. The Japanese manual had some really nice character art and even had little depictions of the different characters interacting with one another. Reproducing even some of those still shots in the game would have went a long way to imply some kind of bond between any of these people. Phantasy Star II also sorely lacked some quality of life things like easy inventory management. Shuffling items between characters and maneuvering through the game's menus was still just as clunky as it was in the first game. One thing they removed after Phantasy Star I was the ability to save anywhere. Now you can only save in a town in Phantasy Star II, making the risk of losing progress with a party wipe a lot more likely. There is a way that you can save anywhere with a special item, but you can't get it by any regular means like finding it in a dungeon or buying it at a store. The manual doesn't even mention that it exists, so how you're supposed to know what it is once you get it is a mystery to me. The lack of item descriptions really wore on my patience. The manual didn't do a good job of organizing this information at all, and the blurbs there don't really tell you anything useful in terms of who can use which items and which materials might be stronger than others. Most of the time, new towns offered better defense or offense, but this was clouded even further by the abbreviations used. You couldn't easily tell which character could use a piece of equipment or which body parts they were even for most of the time. The spells were on an even steeper learning curve. You'd get new techniques like sack and sar and foy, and then you'd go to the manual to find out what they are, and it takes forever to find what you're looking for. Why not make a table or something to condense this somehow? I pretty much had to make my own. One really useful thing was that some pieces of equipment could be used in battle to cast a spell like the Wind Scarf or the Amber Robe. These could be healing or offensive spells that cost no technique points to use, and this became a godsend in later parts of the game where you could only hold so many healing items and technique points were at a premium. The manual did have this information there in black and white, but how to use it was still a mystery. The battles on the overworld and in dungeons are relentless. The encounter rate is just as high as you might expect from a game from the late 80s, and grinding is a necessity since your weapons and armor only carry your stats so far. I usually don't mind grinding in games, but it approached Dragon Warrior NES levels of grinding here. As I mentioned earlier, bringing party members up to speed level-wise was a long and arduous process, so I mostly kept the same party for most of the game. The battles themselves had a nice auto-battle feature that I used pretty often, and I very rarely used offensive spells since I'm a technique point hoarder, but there were a lot of different spells to choose from. Their effectiveness wasn't as obvious as some of the elemental weaknesses and strengths in other games, but some trial and error usually yielded some decent strategies to carry forward. One disappointing thing were the battle backdrops. These were exceptionally drab, especially compared to the bright and location-dependent ones from the previous game. I'm sure there were limitations that might have prevented them from implementing something like that in Phantasy Star II, but considering that you spend about 60 to 70% of the game in a fight of some sort, something mildly appealing to keep things feeling fresh would have been nice. The enemy animations were pretty good overall, and I'm glad that they kept that from the previous game. Many of them could have been best described as twitchy though. It made me miss the disgusting, slow drool drop of zombies and their counterparts from the first game. I will say that the few boss battles looked exceptionally good compared to everything else you come up against. I wish they had done more large-scale boss battles like this throughout the game, but I think I can only count 3 separate fights like this in total. It's a real shame because these big battles were the only major highlights from the entire game for me. The ending of Phantasy Star II was a huge letdown. I usually don't spoil the details of the end of the game like this, but I think I need to talk about it. This is your official spoiler warning if you don't want to know what the ending was like. Okay, here we go. You find out that the corruption of Mother Brain was because of the resurgence of Dark Falls or Dark Force from the first Phantasy Star game. After defeating Dark Falls again and destroying Mother Brain, instead of everything going back to normal and getting a nice ending sequence where people go back to their regular lives again, you get whisked away into a room full of strange people and learn that it was humans that created Mother Brain and were trying to overthrow the people of the Algo system to take over their planets for themselves. Not only do you have a message about the duality of man forced down your throat out of nowhere, but then all of the characters get into a brawl with these strangers and shout random things at their new adversaries before there's a final credit roll. What the hell happened here? Do they survive the fight? Do the humans win and end up taking over Algo in this weakened state? Why didn't Lutz teleport the heroes to safety instead of potentially letting them perish at the hands of the humans? Or better yet, beam himself up there and use his powers to help? I've heard from other people that Phantasy Star IV continues this story and everything gets explained there, but that was 2 whole games away. It took 5 years for the next game to be released in North America, and that still doesn't excuse leaving people playing this for the first time in 1990 hanging, potentially indefinitely, on a non-ending. There is no resolution to anything in this game, and it left me pretty angry at how much time I felt I wasted working toward an ending that wasn't even really an ending. It was one of the biggest shortfalls I've ever encountered in a game with such a significant time investment. After the success of Phantasy Star I, Phantasy Star II had a winning formula to work from to create something bigger and better, but instead it failed miserably. It peeled away so many of the details that made the first game a joy to play, but most importantly, it did a disservice to the lore and the characters from the first game by slapping a bunch of people together to go on a mission that ended up meaning nothing in the end. If they wanted to do a cliffhanger ending that would pick up in a future game, that's one thing, but to end the game on a note that's completely dissatisfying and doesn't even remotely resonate on an emotional level left me feeling scathed. I shouldn't have to play an entirely different game in a series just to have a sense of accomplishment, and as someone who hasn't played the fourth game yet, I guess I'll just keep those dissatisfied feelings tucked away inside me until that time comes. If I'd played Phantasy Star II when it came out and got hung out to dry like this, I don't know that I would have even considered playing the games that came after it. I don't think anyone can tell Phantasy Star II exactly how it made me feel quite as well as Amy did here, so I'll just leave you with her words.